Lesson 20. The end of the road, the death of the person who is ill, the death of the caregiver, and the meaning of care. This is the last lesson in this series, and at the same time one of the most difficult. Throughout this book we have talked about treatment, stabilization, crises, rebuilding life, and the hope that accompanies the caregiver in the daily struggle. Now comes the moment to face what is inevitable. Schizophrenia is an illness that lasts for many years, often a whole lifetime. Caregiver and person who is ill walk this road together until the moment when one of them is the first to go. This is not a topic that can be avoided. Sooner or later it becomes real, first as a fear, then as a question, and finally as a fact. Many caregivers postpone this conversation because it feels too painful, too abstract, or too final. Yet it is precisely the lack of conversation that most often leads to chaos. No one knows who will take over the care, what the person's last wishes are, what to do with documentation, how to give consent to treatment, or who has the right to decide in an emergency. When the caregiver disappears suddenly, through illness, accident, or death, the person who is ill is left alone in a world that has been too difficult for them for years, even with support. That is why this lesson is not about death as such, but about responsibility and preparation for what cannot be avoided. It is also important that the death of someone with a severe mental illness provokes emotions that are quite different from those in relationships without such a burden. The caregiver often experiences relief and despair at the same time, and neither of these feelings is something to be ashamed of. Mourning someone you have fought for over many years has its own dynamic, and the grief for the caregiving role can be just as hard as the grief for the person. This lesson is here to prepare you for all these aspects. The same applies to the opposite situation, when it is the caregiver who asks themselves what will happen to the person who is ill if they die first. In many cases this fear is stronger than the fear of one's own death. That is precisely why this lesson must contain practical, legal, emotional, and spiritual elements, so that you have tools not only to survive the end of this road, but also to come to terms with its meaning. The death of the person who is ill. The death of someone with a mental illness unfolds differently from the death of a person without such a diagnosis. Schizophrenia affects how fear, physical illness, and the very awareness of dying are experienced. In practice, this means that the final stage of life may be particularly difficult. Psychotic symptoms can intensify under the influence of pain, stress, hospitalization, or metabolic changes linked to a terminal illness. It happens that in the last weeks of life the person returns to earlier delusions, starts hearing voices again, or interprets physical illness as persecution. In such moments your role is unique. You do not have to argue with delusions or fight with psychotic content. The most important thing is that you are present, calm and predictable, a quiet point of reference that stabilizes the person's world when all other structures are beginning to fall apart. The person who is ill often experiences fear of death more intensely than someone who is mentally healthy. This stems from psychological disorganization, difficulties distinguishing inner phenomena from outer reality, and a lack of tools to rationalize suffering. It can happen that the person is afraid to sleep because death will come at night, or, conversely, afraid to wake up. They may understand death symbolically, as a spiritual threat, or literally, as sudden annihilation. In such situations, simple anchoring helps. Calm conversation, repeated rituals, physical presence, holding a hand, a soothing tone of voice. Even if the person cannot name their emotions, they respond to the atmosphere you create. In many cultures, death is a religious event. In Islam, it is a transition into God's mercy. In Hinduism, part of the cycle of samsara. In Christianity, the moment of meeting God. In parts of Africa, a return to the ancestors. If the person who is ill has their own tradition, it is worth respecting it. The last weeks of life are not the time for worldview debates. It is a moment in which spirituality, whatever its form, gives the person a sense of meaning and reduces existential fear. A simple prayer, the presence of a priest, imam, pastor or monk, or simply reading a spiritual text that is meaningful for the person, can bring great comfort. As a caregiver, you do not have to believe in the same things. It is enough that you respect their world. Preparing for death also includes practical elements. If the person is at home, there is the need to organize hospice care, a community nurse, adequate pain medication and constant medical supervision. In a psychiatric hospital, the situation is more complex. Not every ward can provide palliative care. Sometimes the person has to be transferred to an internal medicine ward or a hospice, which is not always easy, especially if their mental state makes cooperation difficult. In such moments, your role is to coordinate information between doctors, remind them of the psychiatric history, monitor reactions to medications, and report changes in behavior. The final stage of life often accelerates processes you already know well, from schizophrenia, withdrawal, apathy, disorganization, communication difficulties. What distinguishes it from a usual decompensation is the irreversibility of the situation. That is why it is so important to prepare emotionally. Many caregivers want to rescue the person to the very end, which leads to exhaustion and a sense of failure. Yet at this stage, the goal is not treatment, but dignity and presence. Your task is not to stop death, but to help the person pass through it in the most peaceful, safe, and humane way possible. In schizophrenia, the person's death does not always occur naturally. One of the most painful, and at the same time statistically significant, scenarios is death by suicide. In schizophrenia, suicide is unfortunately a frequent outcome. Statistics show that between 5 and as many as 10% of people with schizophrenia die by suicide, and a much larger percentage make at least one suicide attempt. In practice, almost every caregiver who has accompanied someone for years has at some point had to face the fear of such an event. Yet nothing can really prepare you for the moment when that risk becomes reality. A suicidal death is something different from a natural death. It carries the weight of suddenness, a sense of failure, shock, and a silent, suffocating emptiness that appears before emotions have had time to settle. In the final phase of life, whether because of physical illnesses or a deepening psychological decline, the risk of suicide can paradoxically increase. It happens that the person does not want to burden their family, believes they are a burden to their loved ones, or starts to believe that disappearing will be a relief for them or for others. In other cases, the impulse stems directly from symptoms, voices commanding self-harm, delusional beliefs about an impending catastrophe, a sense that something terrible is about to happen. From a medical point of view, these are illness-driven reactions, not decisions arising from free will. A caregiver who accompanies someone during the last months of life should know that planning palliative care also includes vigilance regarding suicidal signals. This is not about constant suspicion or paranoia, but about a realistic awareness that a person in psychosis, under the influence of fear or pain, may act impulsively and unpredictably. That is why physical safety becomes one element of care, limiting access to high places, dangerous objects, medications, windows or doors leading outside. In hospital settings, the staff is responsible for this, but at home it is the caregiver who becomes the main guardian of safety. The suicidal death of the person who is ill is a special kind of passing also because it often happens suddenly, without any obvious warning. The person may appear to function relatively normally in the days before, show improvement, or even seem reconciled with life. Paradoxically, such improvement can sometimes be an alarm signal in psychiatry. It may be that the person has already made a decision and briefly regains calm. This is not a rule, but it is important for the caregiver to know that in schizophrenia emotional state does not always foreshadow real danger. Sometimes apparent calm is temporary and deceptive. Suicide is one of the ways in which the illness may reach its end. It is not the kind of death that should define your actions or rob your years of care of their meaning. It is part of the reality of schizophrenia, hard but real, and therefore has to have its place in this lesson, alongside information about natural dying processes. The death of the person who is ill is a moment that no one wanted, but which will come sooner or later. If you approach it with preparation and awareness, it will not become total chaos, but the end of a road on which you were their companion. And that means that your role, though painful, is deeply meaningful. The caregiver's grief. Grief after the death of someone with a severe mental illness is never a uniform process. It is not a pain that flows in one smooth wave. It is more like a dense mixture of feelings that change from hour to hour. If death was natural, grief often has its rhythm. First comes silence, then a sense of emptiness, and only after some time does sadness start to sound clearly. But when death is suicidal, grief takes on a completely different weight. This is one of those situations in which the caregiver may feel something that does not fit into any typical category. The suicide of the person who is ill almost always causes a shock in the caregiver. It is a sudden, illogical blow, without prior preparation. In its aftermath there usually appears the question, could I have prevented this? This is an automatic reaction, arising not from the facts but from the human impulse to look for causes. The mind needs something concrete in order to organize chaos. Meanwhile, in schizophrenia, suicide is very rarely the result of any one person's decision, negligence, or lack of attention. It is first and foremost the result of the illness, not of your actions. Psychiatry speaks about this very clearly. The great majority of suicides in schizophrenia result from illness symptoms, especially sudden impulses, command hallucinations, extreme fear, a sense of threat or disorganized thinking. That is why even the best organized psychiatric wards cannot completely eliminate this risk. If experienced doctors and specialized staff are not able to prevent every tragedy, do not expect this of yourself. You do not have supernatural abilities to predict when an impulse will occur that the person cannot control. Grief after suicide is also different because it combines emotions that seem mutually contradictory. Alongside despair, there can be relief, alongside shame, anger, alongside longing, tiredness that has lasted for years. These feelings are not inappropriate. They are a natural reaction of someone who has lived for a long time under enormous psychological and physical strain. If you feel relief, it is not because you wished the person harm, but because your body has finally stopped functioning in constant alarm mode. If you feel anger, it is not because you blame the person, but because the illness stole years of calm life from you. What you are experiencing is part of grief. It does not require justification. The most destructive emotion is guilt. It appears spontaneously and can last for months. If only I'd called one more time, if only I'd gone earlier, if only I'd noticed something in their voice. This inner dialogue can turn grief into a process that harms instead of heals. That is why you must know one thing: you could not have saved someone who was acting under the influence of illness, not free will. Suicide is not a verdict on you as a caregiver, and it is not an exam you failed. It is a tragedy that comes from distorted perception of reality, not from insufficient care. Grief after the death of someone who is ill has yet another dimension: grief for the role. For years your everyday life has been structured around the person, doctor's visits, ensuring medication is taken, responding to crises, securing the home, monitoring moods. When the person dies, the structure that organized your life suddenly disappears. What looks like freedom can at the same time be a terrifying emptiness. This is normal. For many years your mind functioned in a state of constant readiness, and now it has to learn ordinary existence, without the need to keep watch day and night. There is no one right way to grieve as a caregiver. You may cry or be unable to cry. You may feel pain or numbness. You may long or feel emotionally frozen. Everything that appears is allowed. Only one thing is important: do not load yourself with blame for a death caused by the illness, and do not suppress emotions that are part of the natural process of coming out of long-term tension. If you give yourself time, grief, even the hardest, will gradually start to soften. And you will begin to return to your own life. The death of the caregiver. This is one of the hardest questions a caregiver can ask themselves, and at the same time one of those most often postponed for later. Caring for someone with a severe mental illness consumes almost all emotional and practical resources, so thoughts about one's own death often seem abstract. In reality, though, this question is unavoidable. In many cases, caregivers are older than the person who is ill, often have their own health problems, and sometimes are the only person who really cares for them. This means that the lack of a plan for your death may leave the person in a dramatically unsafe situation. The first step is a realistic acknowledgement of the fact that the person's mental illness will not disappear with your death. Their needs will remain the same: stability, supervision of treatment, control of medication, support in everyday activities, response to crises, and organization of contact with a psychiatrist. If you do not prepare a plan, these responsibilities will be taken over by a randomly chosen family member or, in many cases, by no one at all. Then the person is at risk of sudden interruption of treatment, decompensation, homelessness, conflict with the law, or even compulsory hospitalization. Planning the person's future is therefore a form of care that extends beyond your own life, and at the same time part of your responsibility for their safety. The next element is determining who will realistically be able to take over care. This is not about declarations made in emotional moments or with good intentions, but about actual capacity. It is worth having technical, factual conversations with your family about the cost of treatment, the need to coordinate visits, the risk of relapse, the unpredictability of the person's behavior, and what care means in daily practice. In such conversations, it often turns out that people who want to help have no real idea what caring for someone with schizophrenia involves. The sooner realism appears in the family, the greater the chance that someone who truly can take on the role will be found, or that together you will find another solution. In many countries, there are formal tools that allow a caregiver to protect the person in the event of their own death. These include appointing a legal guardian, long-term powers of attorney, documents concerning consent to psychiatric treatment, as well as wills that specify wishes regarding supervision of the person. It is important that such documents are prepared professionally, in accordance with local law, and that the treating psychiatrist is aware of them. In some countries, for example, the USA or Canada, there are so-called psychiatric advance directives, documents in which the caregiver can describe preferred forms of treatment, safety procedures, past reactions to medication, and everything that should be continued when the caregiver is no longer able to oversee it. If the person is sufficiently functional to talk about the future, it is worth involving them in the process. This is not about frightening them with your death, but about creating a shared understanding: who will help them, whom they can ask for support, how continuity of treatment will be ensured, where they should go in a crisis. Such conversations give the person a sense of security and also help them understand that care does not disappear with your death but passes into the hands of other, prepared people. The key principle in this part of the lesson is the awareness that your death does not have to mean chaos. If you prepare a care structure in advance, the person will not suddenly be left alone in a world they cannot manage. A plan will not prevent sadness or loss, but it will prevent catastrophe. It is an act of care as important as all the years of everyday support. Long-term planning of care. Caring for someone with schizophrenia is not a short-term project. It is a process that, in many cases, unfolds over decades and includes changing phases of the illness, periods of stability, relapse, hospitalization, physical problems, and sometimes the physical and psychological aging of the person. That is why the most important rule of long-term care is to move away from a model in which the entire burden rests on one person. Even if you have managed alone for years, this does not mean that a system in which you are the only caregiver is safe. Any crisis, yours or the person's, can bring it down in a single moment. The first step in long-term planning is to create a support network that functions all the time, not only when you are exhausted. In practice, this means identifying at least a few people the person can rely on in different situations: a family member, trusted neighbor, friend, and in some cases a social worker, community nurse, or community therapist. The aim is not for them to replace you in everyday life, but to be real points of contact that will not disappear when you fall ill, travel away, or simply die. A support network is a safety cushion that protects the person, but also protects you from burnout. The next element is introducing repeatable structures that do not depend on your presence. This concerns several areas: regular psychiatrist appointments, a fixed medication schedule, an established system for monitoring symptoms, and regular physical checkups. The more these elements are formalized and independent of you, the greater the chance they will be continued even if you suddenly cannot supervise them. The person's stability should not depend on your memory, intuition, or improvisation, but on procedures that any future caregiver can take over. Long-term care also requires clear crisis plans. Schizophrenia is a relapsing illness. Even with good pharmacotherapy, many people experience further episodes. A crisis plan is a document, or at least a note, describing which behaviors in the person herald worsening, which medications helped in the past, the number of the psychiatric emergency service, which hospital admits them, how they responded to previous hospitalizations, and which de-escalation strategies turned out to be effective. A crisis plan does not eliminate relapse, but it turns it from a catastrophe into a predictable procedure. An important element of long-term planning is also the gradual development of the person's independence. Even if this seems unrealistic today, every step, the ability to cook, manage small amounts of money, travel to the doctor alone, remember medication times, increases their chances of functioning when you are gone. Emphasizing independence does not come from a lack of love or a desire for distance, but from realism. The fewer things the person has to rely on you for, the more stable their future will be. Long-term planning also covers formal and legal issues. In many countries, it is recommended to prepare documents that will make future diagnostics and decisions easier, a history of treatment, lists of effective and poorly tolerated medications, contact details of treating doctors, and legal documents relating to consent to treatment, powers of attorney, and legal guardianship. This kind of documentation creates a bridge between your current care and a future in which someone else will fulfill your role. Summary: death, whether of the person who is ill or of the caregiver, is a topic that is hard to talk about, but which cannot be omitted in long-term care for someone with schizophrenia. In this lesson, we have discussed what matters most in the face of ultimate events, what the person's dying process can look like, including when it is the result of suicide, how the caregiver's grief is experienced, and how to secure the person's future in the event of your own death. These are difficult issues, but necessary, because they allow you to bring order where chaos easily takes over. The key message of this lesson is that the caregiver is not responsible for the person's death, regardless of how it happens, and that good care requires thinking ahead about what will happen to the person in the future. Creating support networks, documents, crisis plans, and procedures is not a sign of pessimism, but of care. Thanks to this, the person is not left alone, neither in life nor after your departure. Lesson 20 closes the series with the hardest, but necessary, topic. It teaches that the caregiver's responsibility is not only about keeping watch here and now, but also about wisely preparing for a time you may no longer live to see. This does not take away hope, it creates safety.